Hi, Prodigal Teens. Pastor Chris here, coming to you on Good Friday. And today, obviously, like I said, Good Friday is an incredibly important day in church history. We are continuing our devotional series on the life of Jesus. And Friday is probably the most action-packed day for Jesus this week. So we're just going to focus on, I think, the most important part. We're going to focus on the death of Jesus today. So let's jump into it. I'm reading out of Mark 15, starting in verse 33. If you have your Bibles, grab them and follow along with me. And let's go. At noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. And at 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? When some of those standing near heard this, they said, listen, he's calling Elijah. Some ran, filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down, he said. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, surely this man was the Son of God. Some women were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, the younger, and of Joseph, and Salome in Galilee. These women had followed him and cared for his needs. Many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem were also there. And that's where we're going to end it for today in our reading. So this is, like I said, probably the most important aspect of Easter here, right? Jesus is on the cross, he's suffering, and finally he dies. So we see this happens at noon, from about noon till 3 in the afternoon, right? So 3 hours, Jesus is hanging up there on the cross in agonizing pain, and around 3 in the afternoon, he cries, Eloi, Eloi, this big Hebrew phrase, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me, right? And there's a strange reaction from people in the crowd, right? When some of them standing near hear this, they say, listen, he's calling Elijah, right? So, the first question that comes to my mind when I read this is, why do they think that Jesus is calling Elijah? Obviously, he's speaking in Hebrew, and Eloi is a Hebrew variant of for the word God. And so, obviously, he's saying, my God, in Hebrew, not my Elijah in Hebrew, right? So where does Jesus, or where do these people standing around Jesus get this idea that he's calling Elijah from? Well, in Hebrew, like I said, Eloi is a form of God, but it's also part of, or the beginning of, the name Elijah in the Hebrew language, right? And so to say this is kind of like, my full name is Christopher, right? But people call me Chris most of the time. So this is just an abbreviated form also of the name Elijah, as well as being a reference to God. So when they cry out in this way, or when Jesus cries out in this way specifically, the people kind of mock him, like, oh, he's just calling Elijah. He doesn't really believe in God, or he doesn't really know the God that I know the way that I know. And so they say someone runs and gets him a sponge with wine vinegar, and they put it on a staff and they offer him to drink, and then they say, leave him alone, let's see if Elijah comes to take him down, right? Now, I don't know if you guys have ever tried wine vinegar. It is an excellent cooking ingredient. It is not something that you drink straight up. It is extremely bitter and extremely hard to stomach, just drinking it straight up. And so when they offer this to Jesus, it's not a kind thing to do. It's not a nice thing to do. Instead, it's almost torturous in a way, right? They soak this sponge with wine vinegar and they put it up to his lips. And not only is it extremely bitter, but it's also, vinegar is extremely dehydrating as well, too. So if he's thirsty, if he's trying to get something to drink while they're doing this, this is actually just going to make his thirst even worse, and make his death all that more excruciating on him. So what they do here is not kind. It's torturous, in fact. And that's why we see them mocking him again, let's see if Elijah comes and saves him. And then Jesus, with a loud cry, he breathes his last breath. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Okay, so what do we know about the temple and the curtain in the temple specifically? Well, in Jewish culture, The temple is where you go to sacrifice, right? Remember back on Monday, we talked about Jesus going and sacrificing at the temple and driving out the people who were selling pigeons and doves there as a way to exploit the Jewish people coming to offer sacrifices to God. And so here, in this instance, we know already from our previous reading that the temple was a place Jews went to sacrifice. And if you went to sacrifice at the temple, there were only certain places in the temple that you could go into. In fact, most Jewish temples have 3 layers to them, right? And these 3 layers are 3 levels of holiness. And how clean you are, how pure you are, determines at what level you can go into the temple and sacrifice. The final level of the temple, the last one, has this big curtain in front of it, and it's called the Holy of Holies. And if you were to go in there, the belief was among Jews that if you were not 100% completely innocent and pure before God's standards, that you would die upon going into there, because it was believed that God lived in this small back room of the temple, that his physical being dwelled in there, and so going in there was the same as facing God face to face, and no man who wasn't innocent could face God face to face here like this. And so when the temple curtain tears in two, in fact, I guess just a little bit more historical background for you on the Holy of Holies. Usually, only one priest a year was allowed to go back there. He would have to do various sacrifices and follow extremely strict cleanliness laws for several weeks before he was allowed to go in there. And they used to tie a string to tie a rope to the priest's foot, just in case if he died while he was within the Holy of Holies because he wasn't innocent enough, they would yank him back out of it with it so that they wouldn't have to go in there and die as well because they weren't clean enough either. So this was an extremely dangerous place to be and an extremely dangerous place to have just kind of open to the general public. So when the curtain temple tears in two, metaphorically speaking, the place where God dwells, the Holy of Holies, is now open for the whole world to enter into, and God is now, instead of saying I dwell here in the Holy of Holies, now God is saying I dwell everywhere with my church and with my people, right? The temple is no longer necessary, and so Jesus' death makes it so that God can, in a metaphorical sense, not reside to this one tiny part of the temple anymore. And this is so amazing and so incredible that a guy watching off in the corner, a Roman centurion, okay, so that's a high-ranking Roman official, not the kind of guy that you're going to convert very easily, is convinced that Jesus is surely the Son of God because of this, because of all of this crazy stuff that happens as this goes on. And finally, we see some women watching from a distance, and it lists these women: Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James the Younger and of Joseph, Salome, and several other women are there. And it says, in Galilee, these women followed him and cared for his needs. Many other women who had come up with him from Jerusalem were there also. So notice who's missing in this passage, right? We've got a bunch of women standing around there, but all of the disciples, all of Jesus's closest friends, are nowhere to be found. They've all deserted him. They've all left him. And the only people left are these women who society at the time would believe that they were useless, that they were of no help. And yet, they have more faith than the disciples have. They have more reason to face their guilt for helping wind Jesus up in the predicament he is than the disciples do. All the other disciples are off hiding and cowering because of what they had done to Jesus. But here, we see women remaining, and as we'll see on Sunday morning, it's the women who go to the tomb and find it empty first, and they're the ones who are given the message of the resurrection first, before any of the disciples and before any of the men. So that's our Good Friday devotional. I look forward to talking to you guys again. I look forward to seeing your faces when this quarantine is all over. Until then, be well.